All right, I think we're about ready to get started. I apologize for my voice. I got a cold over the weekend, so a little bit nasally, but hopefully people on Zoom should be hearing us okay. If not, just say in the chat and figure it out. So thank you guys very much for coming. This is my honors thesis defense that I've been working on with Dr. Christy Till and Dr. Amanda Clark. And the subject of my thesis is the diversity of petrology and eruption initiation mechanisms between Mount Shasta's Misery Hill and Hotlum cone building episodes. So let's get right into it. I need to press the arrow key. So Mount Shasta is one of the southernmost volcanoes of the Cascades volcanic arc, which spreads along the Pacific Northwest, and it is powered by subduction of the Juan de Fuca plate underneath the North American plate. Mount Shasta is one of the southernmost peaks of this mountain range, and because of the Cascades' proximity to many population centers, such as Seattle and Portland, understanding the Cascades and what makes them erupt and what makes them work is very important for hazard mitigation. Mount Shasta itself, its edifice is formed by 4 different cone building episodes, so 4 distinct periods in time where the mountain itself was being built, and we're going to be looking at 2 of those today. So our timeline begins around 280,000 years ago. Any prior cone building events or volcanic episodes were unfortunately destroyed by a wide-scale structural collapse around 300,000 years ago. So the most recent episode that we have is the Sergeant's Ridge cone building event. This lasted until about 100,000 years ago. And like the other cone building episodes, it was a singular but very extended period of volcanism. The following episode was the Misery Hill episode, which lasted from about 60 to 30,000 years ago, followed by the Shastina event, which was very brief, but very powerful and singular in its origins. And then finally, most recently, we have the Hotlum cone building event, which started pretty much right after the Shastina, about 10,000 years ago. And it is what makes up the majority of the volcano's current edifice. And today we're going to be looking at the Misery Hill and the Hotlum episodes specifically. So how do these eruptions even happen? To very broadly generalize it, eruptions happen when the pressure of the magma chamber exceeds the inward pressure of the rock overlying it, which causes the rock to fail and magma to ascend. This can happen through a few different ways. You can have it through external factors, such as in 1980 with the Mount St. Helens eruption. That was mostly caused by a landslide, which depressurized the magma chamber and caused it to erupt. Or you can have more internal processes in the actual magma chamber itself. And these are what we're going to be looking at today, because these actually leave a petrological footprint in the magma and the lavas and materials that eventually erupt, whereas external factors like landslides and things like that don't really leave too much of a footprint that we can actually look back and identify. And we have about 4 different mechanisms for initiating eruptions here. First of which is mafic rejuvenation, which involves a fresher mafic magma intruding into a pre-existing mafic magma. And conversely, we have felsic rejuvenation, which is fresher felsic magma intruding into an older felsic magma. We also have mafic recharge, which involves a mafic magma intruding into an older felsic magma. And this is essentially setting the magma off equilibrium enough to where it's just bound to erupt, sorry. And these 3 methods mostly involve magma mixing. And our 4th method, which is volatile accumulation, more has to do with the accumulation of volatiles through crystallization in the magma chamber, as opposed to different magmas mixing together and causing the eruption. So my 2 driving research questions for this project are, first, what can the petrology of the Misery Hill and the Hotlum lavas tell us about their magmatic conditions and what caused them to erupt? And secondarily, is there any significant difference in the petrology or eruption initiation mechanisms between the Misery Hill and Hotlum cone building episodes? So to start with our materials, I had 3 sets of thin samples from the Misery Hill event, which are going to be referred to as sets 01, 02, and 03, and then 1 set of thin sections from a Hotlum flow, which is set 05. And we also had bulk rock geochemistry, including the major and trace element compositions that were initially recorded by the Washington State University Geoanalytical Lab, but are from the same samples, or at least the same sample sites that we collected them at. And the figure on the right just shows the specific locations that the hand samples and that were used to make the thin sections were collected by in 2017 by the EPIC lab crew. Most of this project involved petrographic analysis, so just a very detailed catalog of the petrographic attributes of all these slides. So the grain size, crystallinity, what minerals are there, what they look like, and pretty much any notable property. So let's take a quick look at our hand samples to start. All these samples are porphyritic in texture, and they range from having about 10 up to 50% phenocryst content. It definitely varies between samples, like one of them not shown here is about 10 to 20%. And on the right-hand side, we have upwards of 50% phenocryst content. The majority of the phenocrysts in all the Misery Hill samples are of plagioclase, usually kind of subhedral, and up to about 4 millimeters in length. We also have occasional appearances of smaller red-brown specks that don't have a discernible crystal habit, which are most likely ittungsite, but hard to be 100% sure. And then there's also some small populations of more small black tabular to prismatic minerals, which could either be a pyroxene or hornblende. Again, it's a little bit hard to tell just because they're so tiny, but they're there. And one of the notable things about the Misery Hill 03 sample set is that they contain quenched magmatic inclusions. So the ground mass in these is about 10 to 20% phenocryst content. And it's kind of the pinkish or orange parts on these, whereas the quenched magmatic inclusions are the grayer chunks in there. They are fine-grained phaneritic, and some of them do have larger distinct phenocrysts of plagioclase, but most of them are kind of, a consistent grain size. They also exhibit a darker, finer rim where they're in contact with the ground mass. And the one on the left-hand side appears to have some vesicles or at least other cavities that are coated in a fine-grained dark gray material. So that's kind of our first sign of any real porosity in these samples. And then our Hotlum sample is about 45 to 50% phenocryst content. It does have the very consistent plagioclase phenocryst that we've been seeing thus far, but it does not have any of the hornblende or pyroxene phenocryst in them that we saw in the Misery Hill samples. There were also some finer grained, slightly porous zones in these, which are more likely just products of the actual eruption itself, as opposed to any processes in the magma chamber. So let's switch gears over to geochemistry. All these samples plot in the and as a more felsic andesite on the total alkali silica diagram, but the quenched magmatic inclusions, which are going to be measured differently here, plot more towards basaltic andesites in their composition, so they're a bit more mafic. And all these samples also plot within the calc-alkaline magmatic series, which is consistent with their origin as an arc magma in a wet setting. So this is a big table with a lot of numbers, but pretty much what it's just telling us is at the very top, we have some percentages for the phenocryst content averaged over each set of thin sections. So the Misery Hill thin sections all averaged to around 35% crystallinity, whereas the Hotlum samples averaged around 20 to 30%. And all the boxes below it just show the distribution of different minerals as phenocrysts from what we could see. So they're very dominantly plagioclase phenocrysts with about 8 to 10% pyroxene content, as well as several different trace minerals that we're going to talk about more here. So overall, overall, these samples do have a porphyritic texture, and the phenocrysts usually get up to about 4 millimeters in length, which is consistent with the hand sample measurements. The ground mass is mostly made of very small plagioclase microlites, although there was a consistent portion of orthopyroxene in the ground mass as well. Phenocryst and glomerocryst were very abundant here, and we'll actually see that there were several different arrangements of compositions for the glomerocrysts. The phenocryst in here exhibited very pervasive oscillatory zoning and reverse zoning, as well as many different sieve and degradation textures in here that will go through mineral by mineral. So to start, plagioclase is the most dominant mineral component of the phenocryst and the ground mass as well, usually around upper 80s to 90% content. The crystals are generally euhedral with a tabular or prismatic habit, and their rims vary pretty widely. They can be very clean or they can be very degraded. Even within one crystal, you can have like 3 nice faces and then one kind of truncated, very degraded face. And there are lots of disequilibrium textures in all these samples.
Yeah.
Example,
Oh, do they need to do it on paper?
uh, for example, we have patchy cores and overgrowth rims, especially in our larger phenocrysts, and oscillatory and reverse zoning as well. So for example, on the upper picture, we have multiple zones of sieve textures that were preserved in one phenocryst, which was pretty uncommon. Very commonly, it was more like the lower picture where there was a thin sieve zone kind of near the outside of the crystal, but then itself encased by a much more well-preserved rim. And yeah. Pyroxenes were the second most populous group of phenocrysts in these samples. They range from about 3 to 5% orthopyroxene and 4 to 5% clinopyroxene, with orthopyroxene being a very minor component in the ground mass as well. The crystals were very variable in whether they were euhedral to anhedral. It kind of depended on their size as well as whether or not they were involved in the glomerocryst or not. And exsolution lamellae and zoning were very common. Orthopyroxene usually had a simple gradual zoning to the exterior, while the clinopyroxene often had reverse oscillatory zoning in them. And you also get occasional twinning as well, but very variable populations of pyroxenes in these samples. And then our first trace mineral is hornblende here. It mostly appears in the O3 Misery Hill sample set at about 4%. And then a little bit in the O5 Hotlum set at about 1% of the phenocryst. In plain polarized light, they had more of a reddish coloration, which indicates that they were a little bit more oxidized. And the crystals generally were very euhedral with this diamond-shaped pattern being very, very consistent. And they often had 1 or 2 distinct zones, which were usually best noted by the difference in birefringence, like in this photo here. But 1 or 2 distinct zones was a very common number for both hornblende and also biotite. So this one, biotite was primarily found in set O3 with a quantity of about 6%. And again, it also had 1 or 2 distinct zones and or a very degraded core. And while the hornblende was more marked by differences in the interference color, biotite usually had much more degraded zoning in them. They had red coloration in plain polarized light, which likely means that they're a little bit more iron rich in terms of their composition. They often had very thick degraded rims. Some of them were fully broken down to the point where they were opaque, but in the ground mass, you could usually see them relatively intact. And then in the quenched magmatic inclusions, they made up about a quarter of the actual inclusion themselves. There were also some trace amounts in sets O1 and O2 for Misery Hill, but they were only found in the glomerocryst and they were very anhedral and interstitial. So they weren't by themselves as phenocryst like they were in sample set O3. Another trace mineral that we identified in here was olivine. So there were trace amounts found in only glomerocrysts in the O1 and O5 sample sets, but they were found as phenocrysts and once as glomerocryst in the O3 sample set. And one curious thing about these olivines is that they look pretty happy to be living in an andesite right now. Their rims, this was probably the best example, but their rims were relatively intact. There weren't any clear alteration minerals like serpentinite or chlorite. Occasionally, you'd maybe get like a little green tint along some of the fractures inside of it, but nothing really that consistent or very strong in terms of degradation. They were colorless in plain polarized light, which could indicate that they were a little bit more magnesium rich as opposed to iron rich. And a couple interesting things that I noted in this specific sample is that we had a very euhedral little cavity in there. I couldn't see actually any crystal in there, like when I turned on the reflected light or anything like that. So I'm not sure where it went, but it might have been inclusion of spinel zircon that had formed when the mineral was crystallizing. This crystal also has several parallel lineations that are probably pretty hard to see from here. But those might be, from what I could research, those might be precipitations of iron oxide minerals along defects in the actual crystal. So nothing I can really draw too many conclusions from, but a very interesting feature nonetheless. Muscovite is a very honorable mention here. It was only appearing one time in one glomerocrys in one slide. And I don't really know how I was able to find it, but since it only appears one time here and it's in a glomerocrys, I can't really draw many conclusions from it, but like I said, it's just an honorable mention for something I saw. And then finally, iron titanium oxides had a very consistent trace presence, about slightly less than 1% of all the samples. They usually appeared as small scattered grains in the ground mass, but they were often concentrated inside glomerocrys, usually kind of along the seams where different mineral crystals would meet. They were opaque and anhedral, very consistent for something like ilmenite or magnetite. And although most of them did appear in glomerocrys in higher quantities, this trend was kind of subverted in the O2 sample set, where they were relatively absent from the glomerocrys instead. And there was a red tinting in surrounding minerals that was somewhat common, but it was hard to tell much else besides that. So a very interesting thing that I noticed in one of these glomerocrys, on the left-hand side, we have a very large phenocryst of olivine, along with some pyroxenes kind of surrounding it. And the pockets of the iron titanium oxides in here were very strange shaped. So I ended up turning on the reflected light and found some very interesting symplectite structures in here. So symplectites pretty much form as a result of a mineral breaking down or a reaction between two incompatible minerals. I'm not 100% sure where this one came from, if it might be connected to the olivine or any of the other minerals in the glomerocrys, but this was a very unique feature, one that I probably can't really conclude too much of, but wanted to show it anyway because it looks very interesting and it tells us a lot about the state of stability of different minerals in this melt. So let's move on from talking about the minerals themselves and go over some overall trends. The glomerocrys in these samples tended to, you could very easily separate them into two different compositional groups, one of which on the left-hand side of the picture was made primarily of pyroxenes, either clinopyroxene or orthopyroxene, with very little plagioclase, whereas on the right-hand side, we have glomerocrys that are made mostly of plagioclase with just a little bit of orthopyroxene and no clinopyroxene. This was a very consistent trend throughout all four of the sample sets. And in all of them, biotite and olivine only appear very rarely in very small amounts, and hornblende is fully absent from these glomerocrys. This is a great signal for fine grain mixing on the scale of just a few millimeters, as well as, of course, having larger quench magmatic inclusions that are visible on the hand sample scale. So these likely originated from a few different, from magmas that went through different evolutions, possibly some that might have been more wet or more dry in their conditions, which allowed different minerals to preferentially crystallize and eventually mix together to form what we have here. There were also lots of indicators for degradation and regrowth in these minerals. For example, clinopyroxene was often very degraded. In this photo, we have what appears to be plagioclase infilling a large degraded core within a clinopyroxene crystal that's also surrounded by a very thin rim of biotite on it. And then on the right-hand side, we have a fractured hornblende crystal, which is being infilled by orthopyroxene. This is just a few examples, but seeing minerals be broken down and then have new ones filling in the gaps was a very common sight throughout all these sample sets. And then finally, here is a thin section view of the quench magmatic inclusions, which are on the bottom right corner of these photos. The left-handed view is plane polarized light and the right-handed view is cross-polarized light. So the boundary between the magmatic inclusions and the rest of the ground mass was very clear-cut. And you can definitely see how the texture is much more phaneritic in these. You can also note that the biotite crystals are degraded almost to the point of opacity in here. So that definitely tells us that there were some very different equilibrium states happening in the magmas that were eventually included in what we have now. So after this, let's revisit our driving research questions for this project. First, let's talk about what the petrology of these two lavas can tell us about their magmatic conditions and what initiated their eruptions. So overall, we observed mineral assemblages from a very wide range of silica contents. For example, we had some presumably more magnesium-rich olivine coexisting with more iron-rich biotite. We had very pervasive reverse and oscillatory zoning in a variety of minerals, the plagioclase especially, but also the hornblende, clinopyroxene, and biotite. We had lots of zones of degradation and rim regrowth that were very consistent. And we had separate compositions of glomerocrysts that appeared to have come from very distinct magmatic evolutions, as well as, of course, having more mafic quenched magmatic inclusions with a distinct composition and mineralogy. So what we can interpret from this overall is that magma mixing was very significant. There were lots of repetitive ventures from equilibrium and into equilibrium for different minerals, and that these changes in condition could often be very rapid. We also have the incorporation of mafic magmas with the quenched magmatic inclusions on both a hand sample down to like a millimeter scale, and that the magma components definitely endured very different evolutions and different conditions during their lifetime. So looking back at our second research question, is there any significant difference between the samples that we have from the Misery Hill cone building event or the Hotlum cone building event in terms of what we just talked about? To start with the geochemistry, not really. They have a very consistent placement on the total alkali silica and the Miyashiro diagrams. They're all kind of clumped together. And looking at the actual nitty-gritty data of the geochemistry, there weren't any significant differences in the element abundances. The phenocryst percent is slightly different between the Misery Hill and the Hotlum samples, but they were variable in the actual hand samples themselves. Of course, Misery Hill ranging from 10 to upwards of 50% phenocryst content, so this probably isn't the best indicator for a significant difference in their origins. And the mineral distribution of their phenocrysts is very, very similar, as you can see on the remaining cells of the table. In terms of the petrography, there was a very consistent presence of disequilibrium indicators like the zoning and the degradation. The ground mass in the Hotlum sample, which is in the bottom right corner, was significantly finer than that in the O1 and O2 samples. But of course, it was very similar to the Misery Hill O3 sample, and the coarseness of the ground mass is probably more of a factor of the actual time of eruption and the process of the eruption as opposed to its evolution in the magma chamber. And there were really no consistent differences in the attributes of the phenocryst and the glomerocryst between the Misery Hill and Hotlum samples. They all exhibited very similar trends in their degradation and their zoning. So I feel pretty good saying that, at least with these samples, there were no consistent differences between the Misery Hill and the Hotlum samples. So looking back at our eruption initiation mechanisms, we have a few key observations in here that help us figure out what most likely caused these cone building events to erupt and what powered their volcanism. First, we have reversely zoned crystals, which is probably most evident in things like the clinopyroxene and the plagioclase, as well as the multiple mineral populations between the different phenocrysts, but also the different glomerocryst compositions, as well as the quenched magmatic inclusions of more mafic magmas. And this is pretty solid evidence for mafic recharge being the most likely case here. So this would involve, simplistically, a fresher mafic magma intruding into a pre-existing more felsic magma, which would have pretty much upset the magma enough for it to prefer to erupt. The second most likely case, if I had to choose one, would be the mafic rejuvenation, just because there are so many mafic indicators in these magmas. We have to remember that their samples or their chemistry is very overwhelmingly acidic. So there definitely has to be a component in these minerals or in these samples. So mafic recharge, very much the most likely case for the eruption initiation mechanism here. And one nice way we can synthesize this is with a magmatic tree. This is a type of diagram that my mentor, Chrissy Till, is pioneering right now that takes a lot of keys from things like the phylogenetic tree in species biology. It essentially shows us the evolution of the magma and the circumstances that got it to where it was today. So just to break it down, starting from the bottom, we're starting with flux melting as opposed to decompression melting, since we're at an arc zone right now. And a few of the little side notes are just some more geochemical pieces of evidence that I didn't really discuss here, but so yeah, we're starting with flux melting since we're at an arc setting. And then we know from looking at the geochemistry that these magmas had both a component of crystallization within the magma itself, as well as crustal melting and incorporation of the country rock. And since magma mixing is very significant here, we can finally plant our endpoint at mafic recharge being the most likely case for eruption initiation here. And this applies to both the Misery Hill and the Hotlum eruptions, so I only have one path essentially plotted here. A little bit of reflection on this project. I think that the two biggest limiting factors of this project are the sample size that we have, as well as our lack of geochemical analysis in-house. So first, we have 3 sets of samples from the Misery Hill event and only 1 set of samples from the Hotlum event. It definitely would have been beneficial to have a few more samples from the Hotlum event, as well as just more samples in general to look at, because you can never really get enough data. But we just had to work with what we had on hand. And then, unfortunately, due to a lack of time, we weren't able to run any SEM or SIMS analyses on the samples that we do have. This would have given us a lot of insight into the actual compositions of the phenocryst and the minerals, and would have helped to possibly confirm some of my interpretations, like the magnesium possibly being, or sorry, the olivine being more magnesium rich, as well as would have given us a lot more insight into the actual zoning that we see here and whether or not we can identify any consistent trends between the different samples or the different events in terms of how they're zoned and how many mixing events might have happened in these samples. So in conclusion, there were tons of disequilibrium indicators in all of these samples. There was little to no difference in the petrology of these samples between the Misery Hill and the Hotlum samples. Magma mixing was definitely essential for the formation of these magmas and their eruption. And mafic recharge is the most likely eruption initiation mechanism here. I'd like to thank Chrissy Till and the EPIC Lab group for really getting me started on this project, as well as Amanda Clark and one of my prior coworkers, Alan Whittington at UTSA, for their advice and guidance throughout this project. Thank you guys very much. Any questions? Yes, Steve.
Great talk. You're talking about going back and getting more samples. Do you think there's any possibility that any of the flows, any of the eruptions out there might represent one or more of those end member magmas that mix?
It's definitely possible. The products of Mount Shasta are very varied. So most of it is like andesite and dacite flows, but you can have things like there's like primitive magnesium andesites. You can have basaltic andesites, basalt cones, things like that. So one of the points of interest with Mount Shasta is that its eruptive products are very varied, which of course implies a more complex system. So it's definitely
different points. Maybe you could do a mixing line, so you could actually see where these compositions are coming from.
Yeah, that would definitely be a good way to take future research for this. Yeah.
What a great talk. It was really nice to see all this petrography. You know, we train students in how to use the microscopes, and it's really great to see someone really take off with it and make these great observations. So where do you think the phenocryst crystallized versus the ground mass?
Well, the ground mass most likely crystallized in like the very latest stages of the magma's lifetime, so likely while it was ascending and or while it was being erupted onto the surface, whereas the phenocryst most likely were much older in terms of the magma's lifetime. They likely crystallized in the latter magma chamber itself, or possibly in previous magmas that mixed together to form the current mixture.
Is the zoning in the phenocrysts a reflection of magma mixing, or what do you think causes the oscillatory zoning?
So the oscillatory zoning, I think most best represents repeated major changes in the conditions of the magma, which could very easily be explained by mixing. If you have magmas with very different temperatures or things like that mixing together very quickly, then the minerals that are growing are going to change their composition. If this is happening several times in a short duration, then you can get oscillatory, like repeated zoning in these crystals.
Thanks.
All right. If there are no other questions, then thank you guys again very much for coming and supporting me throughout my time here. It means a lot to be able to talk about my research today. Thank you.